First up, am I nicely audible throughout the auditorium? Excellent. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you for inviting me and to talk on something that's been in my mind for the last couple of years as I've been sort of writing and thinking about this. The battle marathon and the dangers to democracy that were going on at that time, because essentially early in that year, 490 BC or BCE if you prefer, the adult male native free Athenians did something that was absolutely extraordinary. They went to the polls. They went to vote, like these guys on the vases doing here. And they went to vote for their annual military officers and their civilian magistrates for the forthcoming year, which started fundamentally in the middle of their year, or our year, if you like, in the summer. This was an extraordinary event. It was a huge deal because hardly anyone anywhere else in the ancient world went to the polls to vote like this. And the outcome of that election is sometimes, at any rate, felt to have determined the entire history of the Western world in very many ways. And at this particular point, the Athenians knew it was important, and they sort of knew what was coming. Their city was under threat from the might of the Persian Empire that was ruled by King Darius I. And in the Naples Archaeological Museum, this wonderful, very large vase, it's a 5 feet high vase here, it has decoration on it. It's the name vase of the Darius painter, but the decoration on it very much vividly references Darius's invasion and perhaps what is at stake. On the highest tier is an interesting bunch of divine onlookers and influencers, including Athena, who is leading personified Greece towards Zeus. And there is Apater, who is over on the side here. So this is Athena and this is Greece. Here is Apater, who is deception, who is trying to remove personified Asia away from an altar. And down at the bottom, enthroned in the centre, is King Darius himself in all his kingly majesty. He's labelled, so we know who he is. There's his name in Greek. And he's interacting with a man who's making that sort of peace sign. It's not a peace sign, I think, but he's standing on a platform down at the bottom with the words Persians written on it. And then on the lowest tier of the vase is kind of what's at stake. Here we have a Persian tax gatherer on the table. He's sitting in front of a table there, and he is counting the tribute of conquered peoples there. So the conquered peoples are coming, and he's counting the tribute that they're bringing. And on his table are signs for numbers. He's counting with pebbles, and the signs for numbers, Greek signs for numbers, and these are big numbers, 100, 1,000, 10,000. And he's got a wax tablet with the considerable amount of money of 100 talents etched on it. So this scene, I think, shows certainly what the Greeks feel is what is at stake. This is the likely fate of the Greeks if Darius's goals should be realized. Their suffering, I think, might be more than just financial, but this is what's at stake. So, in those elections, a very charismatic and controversial character called Miltiyades, his name means the son of the red earth, he was elected as one of the 10 Athenian generals, alongside Callimachus, a man called Callimachus, as the Polemarchos, the polemarch, the war leader, if you like, who was an equally important source. This is an interesting thing that we might want to talk about later on. This is an ostrakon. So one of the features that the Athenian democracy came to have was a system called ostracism, in which you could write the name of someone on a piece of broken pottery at an annual election. The person you most wanted to leave the state and whoever polled the most votes had to go for 10 years. And someone has voted for Miltiyades on that particular one, despite his, spoiler alert, heroism in winning this war. And these guys took up their office in the summer of 490 BC, and within a matter of weeks, really, they were taking decisions in a battle that John Stuart Mill very famously said this: as an event in English history, it is more important than the Battle of Hastings. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. So this is what's at stake, perhaps. So what is at stake? Well, democracy, demes and soldiers, I think. Initially, Athens' democracy, at this point really, I think, Athens' democracy had only taken its definitive form around, as we said, a generation, about 18 years earlier, in the aftermath of the expulsion of the tyrant Hippias by these guys. These are the so-called tyrannicides, the tyrant slayers. Actually, they didn't slay Hippias, but that's another thing. But who are a famous group of statues that are now in the Naples Archaeological Museum as well. So Athens had expelled its tyrant. Now, the word tyrant, tyrannos in Greek, tyrant, dictator, didn't initially carry the overtones that tyrant now does in our language. It came to do so later, but not so much at this point. At this point, it simply designated a usurper or his successors and differentiated him from a hereditary king. But after he'd been expelled, Hippias went to live in exile at the court of King Darius of Persia. And this is crucial, I think, because to him and his aristocratic supporters, collaboration with Persia was infinitely preferable to living under democracy. You know, these people like him and his supporters, hated being governed by other factions. They objected to democracy putting what they felt were their social inferiors on the same levels as themselves. They had absolutely no ideological objection to monarchy, and they were perfectly happy to side with a rival state to regain power. Why? Well, because they didn't feel that collaborating with the enemy was acting against their own people. Their people were their family, their relatives, their friends. And for them, class and social status trumped nationalism all the time, I think. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. You know, the Greeks were not necessarily united, either as a nation, if you like, or even within their individual cities and communities. Now, the democratic system that was now in place at Athens had been established by a character called Cleisthenes in probably 508 BC. And it was built on three pillars, really, we're told. Isonomia, which is equality under the law. Isegoria, which is equality of speech. And isokratia, which is equality of power. And you put those together and you get demokratia. You get the power of the demos, of the people. The kratia is the power word, and the demos is the people. But remember that the demos is the adult, male, native, free. So no women, no children, no foreigners, no slaves. That is at the heart of that democracy, of course. But that said, if you are one of the demos, if you are adult, male, native and free, then pretty much you have far more political power than any of us in this room have. You know, and no modern citizen has the same degree of power, I think, to what an Athenian citizen did. And Herodotus made a very telling observation, I think, in talking about this. He says this, an interesting point of discussion, I think, again. He says, it's obvious that freedom of speech, isegoria, is an excellent thing. Here is the proof. When the Athenians were under tyrannical rule, they were no better in the military sphere than any of their neighbours. But once they'd freed themselves from their tyrants, they became far and away the best. An interesting thing to think about. And this system is a complicated system. And again, we might want to talk about that a bit later. But at the core of it it was built on over 100 small localities that made up the state. And these were called demes, like little villages. And these became the basic units of local government. And they were hereditary groups. They were social units as well, with an exceptionally strong and cohesive identity. These demesmen lived, close by one another. They cooperated in local government. They helped one another out at demanding times in the agricultural cycle. They controlled their own membership. They celebrated communal religious rituals and festivals. They were neighbors, they were friends, they were relatives, they were sometimes lovers. And that allowed them, particularly in the context of a war, I think, to assess who were the most effective fighters. They also believed, interesting idea as well, that they and their forebears had always remained in the land where they originated. They were truly autochthonous. And when the Persians invaded that land, then they were going to be prepared to fight and kill and die for it. So they're an interesting group of people. And along with these sort of coveted rights of Athenian citizenship, of course, which were considerable, came duties. And one of those was that men of the relatively prosperous class of people that they called the Zeugitai. There were 4 wealth classes, and the Zeugitai were the third of these 4 wealth classes. They were relatively prosperous. They could afford their own armour because the state didn't provide it. But so people of this class, the Zeugitai class or higher, one of the things you had to do was to serve as a heavy-armed hoplite soldier in the Athenian military when necessary. And the average-sized deme, they varied in size quite considerably, but the average size one would have sent about 56 hoplite soldiers to fight at Marathon. And that's important. These small numbers are important, I think, as well. I think they constitute what in modern military parlance is a primary group. On the battlefield, this is absolutely essential. As one of my colleagues has put it, acting in congruence with group norms not only maintains or enhances the soldier's status, but also ensures continued access to physical and psychological support. He's a very fine student of all this and an ex-soldier in himself. But interestingly, these guys were not professional soldiers. They were amateur warriors. But the capacity they had, I think, to endure sustained and savage close quarters combat, as we're going to see, is exceptional. So, why are they fighting? Well, in a few years earlier, 499 BCE, just shy of a decade after Cleisthenes' reforms, the culturally Greek cities of Asia Minor, so the coast of modern Turkey, who'd long been part of the Persian Empire, revolted against their overlords. And Athens and another city called Eretria sent ships to help. Not many, but they sent ships to help. And the Greeks burned the regional administrative capital at Sardis, and they accidentally destroyed the temple that was on this site here, of an important temple of the great mother goddess Cybele, sometimes known as Kubaba, an equivalent perhaps of Cybele in other areas. So this temple was burned. And Darius' reaction was famous throughout the Greek world. Here he is in his chariot. He's actually hunting lions, firing his bow with the god Ahura Mazda, a key god of the Persians, hovering in the air above. His reaction was well known. He asked for his bow, he shot an arrow into the sky, and he prayed, "O Zeus," actually he means, that's a Greek translation of Ahura Mazda, "may it be allowed for me to exact vengeance on the Athenians." And once he'd made the request, he instructed one of his servants to say 3 times, whenever his dinner was being put in front of him, "Master, remember the Athenians." And he did. when the revolt was duly quashed, he sent heralds to Greece to demand earth and water as tokens of submission. Now, the Athenians, interestingly, had actually done that once before in the past, which technically made them subjects of the Persian king. But when they were asked again, they made a dramatic U-turn. They now threw Darius's ambassadors into a pit that was reserved for condemned criminals. And Plutarch, one of our sources, also includes a story that the interpreter was put to death for daring to use the Greek language to transmit the commands of a barbarian. Really interesting. Essentially, this gave Darius, in all his wonderful names, this is his tomb here in what's now Iran. The many languages spoken within his realm, but it gave him essentially just grievances to subjugate Greece, except that, interestingly, I think, he may already have had an invasion in mind. And Herodotus, who's one of our main sources of this, gives us a rather sort of sexy vignette of him in bed with his wife and queen Atossa. And they're talking. And she says, "You're young. You should be doing something dynamic to prove to the Persians that they've got a real man ruling them. I want you to invade Greece. I've heard all about the amazing women there, and I want some Spartan, Argive, Athenian, and Corinthian slave girls to wait on me." "Okay," says Darius, "I'll start the war." Right. It's great. But interesting, I think that this, if you like, Atossa in bed scene predates the burning of Sardis. So it's not revenge. Atossa doesn't want revenge. She wants conquest. And essentially expansionism is perhaps the default position of the Persian Empire. So that's why they're coming. So in they come, and the armies arrive at Marathon. So in, again, 490, Darius' forces move across the Aegean Sea under the command of Datis and Artaphernes. They're their commanders. The armada is said to be 600 ships strong. It's a kind of conventional figure. Persian navies are always, in the Greek tradition, 600 ships strong. And sailing with them was Hippias, so the if you like, the puppet tyrant in waiting for when Athens' democracy was brought to heel. And when the Persians coming into Greece sacked Eretria here, which had sent ships against them, they sacked that town. When they did that, then half of their war aims were already accomplished. And then on Hippias' advice, Darius' forces now sailed over into Attica, the region of Athens, the greater Athens region, if you like, and landed here in the Bay of Marathon, about 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. And this is a place, the plain, there's a plain by the sea, hemmed in by mountains. So here, this plain provided excellent terrain for their very formidable cavalry. The Persian cavalry were very good. But I think the fact that it was confined there between the sea and a series of impressive and quite high mountains meant that the topography also held advantages for the defenders, at least if they could harness those effectively. There were key areas in it. There was also a marsh, a great marsh at one end of the plain, and the northern horn of the bay was sort of created by a peninsula called the Kinosouria, the dog's tail, is what it means there. And the Persians would have drawn their vessels up stern first on the sand, probably at modern Skineas Beach, here in the protected from the weather by the Kinosouria there. And as they did that and bivouacked up at the northern end of the plain, then I'm pretty sure that they were feeling very confident. You know, they must have thought that in the unlikely event of the Athenians coming to confront them here, then they would simply overwhelm them, or that once they marched on the city, then they'd just take it by storm, or they would secure its betrayal by fifth columnists. It looked very much to them, I think, like a win-win-win situation here. The Athenian army, for its part, had already assembled in Athens, and How many of them were there? Well, it's difficult, really difficult with ancient numbers in these contexts. Herodotus just says there were only a few of them. That's all he gives us. Never gives actual figures. He implies that all the 10 Athenian tribes, they were a tribal society, all the 10 tribes were there. And if the army was at full strength, then comparison with other Athenian military activities would give a ballpark figure of about 9,000 to 10,000 hoplite soldiers. And that's very much in line with the figures that are given by other sources too. Now, these are interesting guys, I think, that the marathon generation, these fighters, liked to fight hand to hand. The use of light-armed troops, who they called psiloi, here's one being stabbed by a Persian, the javelin throwers or archers, that's not the norm in the Athenian military in 490. And it's not just because they think that psiloi, light-armed guys, are inferior troops. They are inferior men. This is really interesting. Fighting at a distance, or indeed fighting on horseback, is a soft option as far as they're concerned. Only the heavy-armed hoplite soldiers fight eyeball to eyeball. Only the hoplites are real men in Athenian parlance. And these real men, here shown on a fine vase of roughly this period, equip themselves, as pretty much as you can see here, with a 2.5 to 3 meter long thrusting spear that they wield one-handed, a bronze Corinthian-style helmet, as they call it, a bronze corselet with a linen tunic underneath that serves as underwear, flexible bronze greaves, and a circular shield called an aspis that's made out of wood or hardened leather, and it's faced with bronze. Typically the shield is about 80 centimetres across. These are big and they're heavy. They weigh between 8 and 15 kilos. And actually, just by the by, contrary to popular belief, the hoplite is not named after his shield. The Greek word hoplon means a tool or an implement, and a hoplite, a hoplites in Greek, is simply someone who is equipped, not someone who's tooled up in the military sense. And in fact, that term hoplite doesn't appear until much later, after the Battle of Marathon, in 467, actually. In 490, the words they're using are probably aichmetes, which means a spearman, or panoplos, a totally equipped man. But these totally equipped men, deployed in what's usually described as a phalanx, that's a Greek word. They fight shoulder to shoulder and one behind the other, usually in files 8 men deep. As soon as they get to within striking distance, then the front ranks simply begin a frenzied stabbing with their spears, which are usually wielded overarm, as these guys are doing here on this very fine vase there. And the spear thrusting was accompanied by a thing that they called othismos, shoving. So the rear ranks shove and push the backs of the ones in front. So what you get is something like a hyper-violent rugby scrum or a rolling maul or something, except there's no referee and there's no rules of the game. So this is how they essentially fight. But somewhat surprisingly, these Athenian spearmen did hardly any training. This is interesting. It's a class-based attitude, is this. The elevated social status of these guys who are fighting as hoplites means that any form of training is deeply resented. For them, extensive training equals forced labour equals slavery. We don't do it. Really interesting. Really interesting. So, where do they have to make their stand? Do they go for the city, behind the safety of the walls? So Athens is here. So do they stay in the city but at risk from betrayal within? Do they go to Marathon, to the field of Marathon, there with all the risks associated with confronting this larger and more mobile enemy on disadvantageous terrain? Well, it seemed that the general Miltiyades persuaded the authorities in Athens and the people of Athens to take the Marathon option. It was a humongous gamble, was this, but they went all in. They put all their chips in. And away they go. They looked for help for others as well. They sent a plea to Plataea, a reasonably close town that they always had good relationships with up here. And they also dispatched the first of their famous marathon runners to Sparta. It's a long way. This is a great thing. This is a man called Philippides. Sometimes he's called Phidippides or Phidippides. But he set off to Sparta and he arrived the day after he left Athens. It's a huge run, amazing. Spartans are happy to help, but not now, because they're celebrating an important festival which culminates at the full moon and they can't fight while this is on. So, meanwhile, if you like, the Athenian soldiers, led by Callimachus and their tribal generals, of whom Miltiyades is the 10th, we're told, they needed to be at Marathon before the Persians could get out of the plain. They just cut them off. We don't know what route or what routes they may have taken, but we do know that when, the Greek beautiful phrase, rosy-fingered dawn shed her light on the mountains of Marathon, the following morning they were there, encamped by the sanctuary of Heracles down here. So that they'd made it there, covering the southerly exits of the plain. Miltiyades had seized the initiative, and the timely arrival of the Plataeans, with anything between 600 and 1,000 extra hoplites, gave the Athenians a bit of a boost as well. Then, however, there was a standoff for several days in which the Greek high command was split. 5 of the 10 generals were for caution. The other 5, including Miltiyades, were in favour of immediate engagement. So there was a deadlock. And to break that deadlock, they decided in the end to consult Callimachus. His precise status is hard to ascertain, in fact, about how he was appointed and what authority he had. But Miltiyades made an emotive appeal to him to fame and freedom, and Callimachus cast his vote for action. So they were ready to go, and on or around the 12th of September, probably, might have been in August, but around the middle of September, a good opportunity to attack presented itself. So we come to the battle now, Marathon itself. So you can calculate that at 8 men deep, the Greek line would stretch about 1,250 metres. But it needed to be about another 300 metres long if it were to match the width of the Persian formation. So the Greeks thinned their centre but kept the wings of their army at full depth. This is really frustrating, none of the ancient sources, this is a thing that we have to live with as ancient historians, they so often don't tell us what we want to know, particularly when it comes to fine detail, and particularly when it comes to battles. But none of them tell us the starting positions of the two armies. So all we can assume, I think, is that Greeks would logically want to fight on the narrowest front that they possibly could, and the plain presents a number of options for that. So they could go there, sort of between Mount Stavroukaki and the sea, so Greeks in red, Persians in blue. That would work, perhaps. They could come further down the plain. Either side, there was a torrential, dry riverbed that ran down the middle, so maybe something like that. Or maybe differently, with the Greeks sort of parallel to the sea, with the mountains behind them, Mount Kotroni behind them, sea behind the Persians. They could go blocking one of the valleys, the Vrana Valley, out of the plain, so blocking that with the Persians again with their backs to the sea. They could go something like that with their backs to the north, the northern slopes of Mount Agrialiki, with the Persians facing them there, or at the entrance to the plain, perhaps covering the road to Athens. All of those are possibilities, and there are nuanced and nuanced versions of all of those theories, really, and valid arguments can be made for and against pretty much all of them. But what we do know is that we're in the plain of Marathon, and the Greeks are fighting Persians whose elite warriors look rather like this, with spears and bows. And on Miltiades' order, we're told, the Greeks made for the Persians at a run, at a jog, at the double in quick step. Interesting Greek word, dromor. The Persian tactics of choice were to use their cavalry to shower the enemy infantry formations with missiles, wheel about, regroup, and retreat. The infantry would, again, these guys here, would use what they called sparabara tactics, from spara, which means a shield. So they would create a wicker palisade of shields on the ground in front of the first rank, and then unleash endless volleys of arrows from behind those shields until the enemy's formations disintegrated. And only against a beaten and disorganized army would the Persians choose to engage hand to hand. So the Greeks have to get at them very quickly. And Herodotus puts the distance between the battle lines initially at about 1,425 meters. For the final 175 of that, that's the range of the Persian bows. So they've got to endure salvo after salvo of archer fire as they bear down on the Persians. The thing is that the Persians are not expecting this onslaught. They think it's completely mad. And it could have been that the Greeks had spotted that the Persian cavalry were not available at that particular moment, so they took the opportunity to attack. Not all the scholars accept that, but others do know that Herodotus doesn't mention cavalry in his description of the battle, and they wonder whether the horses are being watered at the time there's a spring here, or they have their bivouacs at the northern end, or indeed whether they are embarking on the ships to try and sail around the back of the Greeks, or indeed to sail to Athens itself. So we don't know, but those are possibilities. But whatever. And Herodotus's description of the battle, of the main action anyway, only takes less than 150 words in Greek. Extraordinary for this amazing battle. Here it is in my translation. So the Athenians engaged all together with the barbarians and fought in a way that is worthy of the highest praise. Firstly, they were the first Greeks that we know of who used running at the enemy as a tactic. And secondly, they were the first to endure the sight of Median, that means Persian, Median clothing, and the men who wore it. Prior to that, the Greeks were terrified simply to hear the name of the Medes, or the Persians. They fought for a long time at Marathon. The barbarians were dominant in the centre. That is where the Persians themselves and the Sakai were deployed. There, the barbarians got the other hand, smashed through the Greek line, and began to pursue them inland. However, the Athenians and Plataeans were triumphant on both wings, and once they'd broken through, they allowed the routed barbarians to flee and brought their wings together to engage those who had smashed the centre of their line. And the Athenians were victorious. They followed the fleeing Persians, smiting them as they went until they got to the sea, where they called for fire and began to seize the ships. And that's pretty much his description of what happened. There are some artworks which might help this particular sarcophagus here in Brescia. Now, we know that the Athenians captured 7 Persian ships. It may be that we're fighting by the ships here. There are ships' sterns here. There are barbaric-looking Persians over here, and heroically nude Greeks fighting against them, despite being bitten in the leg by this particular guy here, and so on. But the Greeks are doing all right there, generally speaking. But they suffer high-profile casualties. Callimachus himself is killed in action. We're told he was transfixed by so many spears that he remained standing upright even though he was dead. And he had a memorial, a wonderful memorial that's been reconstructed now from fragments in the archaeological museum, the Acropolis Museum in Athens, and it has an inscription on it. You can see some of the text here, and I've transcribed it there. So it says, "Callimachus of the deme of Aphidnae." So you're defined by your deme, dedicated me to Athena, the messenger of the immortal gods. That's Nike, the victory figure who's on top of it there. It said, who dwell in their Olympian homes. And it says, "Callimachus, polemarch of the Athenians, who fought the battle of Marathon for the Greeks, to the sons of the Athenians, a memorial." And then there's missing letters that don't tell us anything more. So we have interesting memorials. We have another one. Pausanias, a travel writer, says that the grave on the plain is that of the Athenians. And this mound, he says, is called the Souros. It was originally 12 metres high, 50 metres across. And some scholars argue that that is where the thick of the fighting took place. That's where the Athenian war dead seem to have been buried on the battlefield, which is unusual. Normally they would be taken back to Athens and given their state funerals there, but burial on the battlefield was a special honour for these people. There's another monument that Pausanias saw. That was what he calls a trophy of white marble. Here are some fragments of it in the Marathon Museum now. This seems to have stood further north, near to the Great Marsh. And it's interesting, I think, that the English word trophy comes from a Greek word, tropaion. And these trophy monuments, these tropaia that were decked out with captured weaponry, were usually erected at the point where the battle turned. So at the turning point of the battle. In Greek, tropair means turn. So it's a monument of the turning of the battle. So it seems to indicate that at least an important, crucial moment in the battle there took place on that spot a bit further north up the plain. Pausanias was also informed that when he went there. He went there 700 years after the battle almost, and was taken around by guides, but he was told that the barbarians incurred the most casualties in the Great Marsh because they didn't know the paths through it. And Herodotus says that the Persians lost 6,400 casualties as against 192 dead on the Athenian side. So we've won, but not quite, if you like. The victory at the Marathon Plain didn't quite end Athens' jeopardy because the Persians pushed their intact ships off from the shore and they made a dash for the undefended city. So they sail down to Cape Sunion and then back up towards the city. So they make a dash for the city, which is going to be undefended. And so we have a race now with the Persians in their ships, the Greeks on foot. And it's, if you like, there's this great race for the future of democracy. Whoever gets there first is going to win, very possibly. And one runner, of course, is immortalised in that, or he immortalised himself as the second of the great marathon runners. It's this guy, so Euclides, as it said, and Plutarch says that most historians say it was Euclides, who, still hot from battle, ran in full kit, burst through the Archon's doors and could only say, "Rejoice, we won." Then he immediately breathed his last. And there he is in a fine 19th century rendition of it, breathing his last for you. But the Athenians won that foot race as well as him. The main Athenian force arrived before the Persians and stymied in their intentions. They called off the mission. They set sail for Asia, and that was the end of that phase of this conflict, at any rate. And as the blood was drying on the plain of Marathon, 2,000 Spartans eventually arrived, just the day after the battle. They'd left at the full moon, as had been promised, but they only got into Athenian territory the day after. So Miltiyades, this guy who had once upon a time been a tyrant himself, actually, and in many ways possibly a Persian collaborator, but he'd come over to the Athenian side very much. He was hailed as saviour of democracy, and there's a wonderful helmet in the Archaeological Museum in Olympia here, which is a classic hoplite helmet, and it has his name inscribed on it in Greek text there, Miltiyades. It may be from Marathon, it may be from one of his other campaigns actually, but we always like to think that it's the Marathon, and that's how the museum presents it to you anyway. So Miltiyades dedicated this to Zeus, that was dedicated at Olympia, and as I say, traditionally seen as a fitting dedication for the victory at Marathon. Darius, for his part, yearned for revenge. And I thank you for listening thus far. Thank you.